Welcome to the podcast of Studio Central and Eastern Europe, in which we present the latest research on the region. My name is Peter Vermeersch, and it is my honor to have in the studio Lien Verpoest, who is Professor of Eastern European and Diplomatic History at the KU Leuven University in Belgium, and coordinator of the project Challenges and Opportunities of EU Heritage Diplomacy in Ukraine, which is a big multi-country project dealing specifically with heritage. And Ukraine, a country in a war situation right now. Lien, welcome to the studio, and I would like to begin our conversation with the question about where we are in Ukraine in relation to your project. Heritage sounds like something which would be very important after a war is over, but we are very much in the thick of the war in Ukraine right now, still, unfortunately. So could you tell us a little bit about where your project fits in relation to the current affairs?
Thank you, Peter. Indeed, it's true that to a certain extent there are more urgent matters at stake right now in Ukraine, but our focus on heritage in Ukraine is something we've actually been working on for several years, even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we came to this idea because we noticed that heritage, even since 2014, the Russian annexation of Crimea, we noticed that heritage came under pressure, and that in, let's say, heritage studies, very often the focus lies with heritage as a means of bridging communities, as a means of bringing people together. And we noticed the opposite in Ukraine since 2014, that heritage kind of became a topic of conflict and even kind of reinforced conflict. And so this is something we noticed since 2014, started doing research on, and then, of course, when 2022 happened, this kind of intensified to such an extent that we saw a complete destruction and kind of conscious destruction of heritage in Ukraine by Russia, hundreds and hundreds of objects of heritage, that we decided, okay, this is something we need to start a bigger project on.
That's interesting. So heritage and contested heritage, mutually contested heritage between Ukraine and Russia was one of the drivers of the conflict. Mm-hmm. And it continues to be one of the results also of the conflict, that the meaning of certain heritage objects then become more contested as a result of conflict, if I understand you.
Yes, definitely. And so this is something we saw already, first of all, in 2014. This contested heritage, a good example in Ukraine is, of course, all the Soviet heritage that was there. After the regime change in 2014, a decommunization law was voted in Ukraine, 2 decommunization laws actually in 2015, where you could see that they kind of divide between unwanted heritage on the one hand and then mutually claimed heritage on the other hand. And the decommunization laws fell under what you could call unwanted heritage. So these laws stipulated that, for example, toponyms as street names, city names with Soviet elements in it could be changed.
Could be changed or needed to be changed? Or
needed. And a lot of them already before 2022 had been changed.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest example is Dnipropetrovsk, which became Dnipro, but there's many, many other
street names. It's the name of a city that was changed, not simply the name of a street, but a whole city was renamed.
A city where millions of people live. So they really took it seriously. Maybe in comparison to other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, this decommunization law was a bit late, but they saw the necessity. At the same time, you could also see the gradual, not really removal of monuments yet, but actions that were undertaken, painting Lenin monuments yellow and blue, this kind of still a bit jokingly done, but this also changed in 2022. So that's the story.
The joke was not so funny anymore.
No, definitely. And so what you then could see, this was, let's say, unwanted heritage. But then on the other hand, we also noticed already 10 years ago the emergence between Russia and Ukraine of mutual heritage claims. And this was also really a point of contention, which became really also a problem or a challenge for international law.
Can you give an example of such mutual heritage claim?
Yeah. So one of the most famous examples is the Scythian gold. I don't know if you heard of this case. Yes, so, and this, I think, only has been resolved last year. What happened was that the beautiful Scythian gold artifacts of Crimea were, during the regime change in 2014, exhibited in Amsterdam in the University Museum, the Allard Pierson Museum. And then, of course, Crimea was annexed by Russia. And so it became really a big problem because the museum didn't really know who do we have to return this gold to. And so the Russian government said, well, this is actually property of us now, so you have to return it to Crimea to us, whereas the Ukrainian government said, no, this was property of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea of Ukraine, so it needs to be returned to Kyiv now. And so it has been a huge international hassle. A lot of lawyers have thought a lot about it, and now it finally has been returned to Kyiv, but it's one of the many examples. At the same time, there's the Tatar heritage in Crimea, which is also being damaged or kind of unsuccessfully renovated by the Russian government right now, and where there's also a lot of Tatars have fled to Kiev, and also they try to really put it on the UNESCO agenda to say, this kind of willful destruction of our heritage, tangible and intangible heritage, is something that really needs to be dealt with on a higher level.
So we're speaking really about a broad spectrum of things, right? Of stuff. It's objects, it's buildings, it's monuments, it's museum exhibitions, it's intangible heritage. So all of this, is that part of your research project, or do you focus on particular cases, or how do you approach this? Because you're also working with a lot of colleagues on this right now.
Yes, we're working with a lot of Ukrainian colleagues, but we have 15 partners from all over the world, all with a specialization in Eastern Europe, mostly Ukraine. There's political scientists, but also historians, heritage professionals, so it's a very good mix. And so what we do, indeed, the types of heritage that we study are very diverse. Of course, the most obvious destruction of heritage you see is the destruction of historical buildings and willful destruction of historical buildings. Also, sometimes the Russian troops target museums of very famous Ukrainian artists. On the other hand, you also see libraries where precious manuscripts were kept, have been bombed. So it's very broad, and this is the tangible heritage. But what you, of course, also notice, just the more Ukrainian heritage gets targeted, the more important heritage becomes for the Ukrainians, and the more they kind of
gains additional meaning, so to speak.
Definitely, and so the more kind of the focus on heritage becomes bigger and bigger, and
the symbolic value of it becomes greater.
Very much. So going from people's costumes, the vyshyvanka, of course, the traditional Ukrainian shirt, but also to folk music, cooking, everything becomes more and more important. And this is also something we study because we have a separate group within our project who studies the global perception of heritage in Ukraine, of Ukrainian heritage, the destruction of it, but also how in different parts of the world they report on this. And so they've done a very big media analysis, so looking at European media, US media, but also the media in the global South and Asia Pacific, to see, really to check all the newspapers and to see how is are they reporting on the war in Ukraine, the destruction of heritage, and also the role of the EU. And we really got some very interesting insights, because you can see in the EU, in many countries, that there is a lot of attention for this. There's also a lot of visual reporting on it. It has such a strong, a destruction of a statue, for example, of Taras Shevchenko, the famous Ukrainian poet. You know that the Russian troops very often, when they enter a city, there is very often a statue of Shevchenko, and they shoot him through the head. So this kind of actions, it resonates, the injustice of these actions. So you can see in the EU that there is a lot of reporting. In the US newspapers as well. But then in the global south and Asia Pacific, so in India, in China, but also we've checked newspapers in South Africa, of course there's less attention for it.
Yeah.
And what is very interesting, especially in the global south, is that the whole, let's say, discourse on decolonization of Ukrainian heritage is something that with them does not resonate. Their opinion is decolonization, this is something that we deal with, but this is not something that Ukraine can claim to deal with. So it gives interesting insights.
Yeah, it's another framing, and it fits much more with the Russian framing of things, I'm sure. Yeah. So you work with Ukrainian scholars in Ukraine, but also Ukrainian scholars outside of Ukraine. Could you give us an idea of how big your network is, how you do the day-to-day research on this?
Yeah, so we have 15 partners from so several in Ukraine, but then also University of Canterbury in Christchurch in New Zealand, in Georgia. We have people in Tbilisi. There's also people in the US at Tufts University, Netherlands, Tartu.
It's
all over
project.
The world. Yeah. So the biggest challenge is to find a meeting online where everybody is awake, let's say. So it's often at noon, and then some people have to rise very early. But so we've divided our works. Of course, we had a big conference recently, and then we all came together and we discussed what we are doing. It's a 3-year project. And so we're working on different levels in different groups. Some people are really writing about destruction of heritage or specific forms of Ukrainian tangible and intangible heritage, for example, also musea. So there's some specialists working on this. Then we have this group looking at the perception of heritage globally. And then we also have a group who is more focused on policy advice, writing policy reports. Because in the end, we want also a bit to see how the EU can play a role in this, because heritage, normally you link it to UNESCO. Council of Europe also might play a role in it. You have big NGOs like Europa Nostra. EU has not yet been so visible. So
what is the EU role? Because the EU is very much prominent in the title of your project. It's about EU heritage diplomacy. So what do we need to understand under this label?
Well, it's very interesting. This is something we've been studying now. The EU has a lot of ambitions when it comes to protecting heritage in conflict regions, but it's very recent ambition. And
when you talk about, sorry to interrupt, but when you talk about the EU, you're thinking mostly about the European Commission?
And the External Action Service. And so let's say they've issued a document on the policy, let's say it's heritage policy and international cultural relations, that's how they call it, in 2016. And there you can see in this document that they still kind of are in the mindset of heritage should bridge gaps, bring people together. And the element of conflict was not yet so much present. But they try to see, okay, who are the main actors working on international cultural relations and heritage, and how can the EU also play a role in its foreign policy, also add, let's say, cultural diplomacy or heritage diplomacy. Fast forward to 2021, the world is changing, let's say, and then you can see they issued a new document, and then they really started focusing on heritage and conflict. How can we deal with this? Can we develop our own policy, or is it better to work together with some major organizations like ALIPH or UNESCO or ICOM? These are kind of all organizations working on heritage. And so then fast forward to 2022, and then of course Ukraine happened, and this massive destruction of tangible heritage. And then the EU actually acted really fast, and they created a working group with heritage experts from all over the world, advising the EU on, you've had some ideas on how to deal with heritage and protecting heritage. How can you now help Ukraine? Because this is of the most, this is the highest urgency.
This is important, yes.
And this, of course, also a bit goes back to what you said at the start of our talk. Is it the most urgent thing? Because, of course, everyday lives are being lost in Ukraine, and which place should we give to heritage, which is stones, objects.
Yeah.
And so this is something we also see that is difficult to deal with. You can have the best of advice, But the Ukrainian government, for example, has so much to deal with that heritage is something that they want to protect, but it's not their first priority, logically.
Mm-hmm. Now, if we think a little bit further towards the future, it's always very difficult, of course, but do you think that heritage will also have a role to play in a post-war situation, in a sort of reconciliation scenario? Do you think heritage will be important there too?
Concerning reconciliation, I think people's minds are not set to this yet.
That's clear.
When it comes to reconstruction, I see very interesting things happening. So, and that's something that I've also noticed with the Ukrainian people. The way they've dealt, for example, with this unwanted heritage. It's a country being day to day faced with the conscious destruction of their heritage by Russia.
Yeah.
But still, I see that they do not react in the same manner. So, for example, there's, I talked briefly about Lenin fall already since the early 90s in many Eastern European countries.
So
Lenin
the toppling
statues
of the
were
statues
removed.
of Lenin.
Now, in Russia, they speak of Pushkin fall very often. So it's not the decommunization of heritage anymore, but it's the de-Russification of heritage, which is going on. But it's a rather careful de-Russification, I must say. They could just say, we'll remove everything, we'll, destroy everything. Whereas if you see, a good example was the statue of Catherine the Great in Odessa. They really thought, okay, what will we do with it? They didn't remove it immediately. They first covered it, and then they did kind of a big survey among the people of Odessa. What do you think you should do with it? And so both dealing with unwanted heritage and also thinking about the reconstruction of destroyed heritage is something in which I find that Ukrainians think on a community level.
Yeah, try to involve the citizens in this, this reconstructing and rescaping the landscape that's out there.
And they have a lot of also creative ideas. Of course, there's also a lot of discussion because some people say we need to reconstruct everything exactly as it was. A younger generation sees a lot of opportunities to make something completely new. But it's very interesting to see, and also hopeful, I think, to see how people are thinking about it while a part of their country is still being destroyed.
Yeah. The flip side might then be that there is perhaps in Russia also a re-Sovietization in place, which is also a kind of heritage reconstruction in a way, you could say, but then going really in the opposite direction.
Yes, most definitely. And so this is also something you see in the occupied territories of Ukraine, that Lenin statues are being put back, that also Tsar statues are being erected. For example, in Crimea, huge statue of Tsar Alexander III, a very ugly one also was being put, like sitting, it's enormous. And it's kind of the focus on history in Russia. As you know, since Putin has been very strong, but it's a very selective focus on history. And so this is something that can also be seen as a form of heritage diplomacy, policy, I don't know how you should call it, but the reinstating Russian heritage, Soviet heritage, but it's mainly Russian and almost imperial heritage is something that is very striking, which is also going on.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you would think that a landscape of war is a landscape of destruction, but in what you are telling is that it also is a landscape of construction and of reconstruction of a kind of history that is then visible in all kinds of objects and buildings.
So it's also a war of narratives, and there's this Russian narrative, which is very much focused on declaring the Russianness of parts of Ukraine.
Yeah, fascinating, very rich research field, I think, and I wish you all the best with the research that is still to come in this fantastic project. Thank you, Lien Verpoest.
Thank you.